This is part 5 of Microchip's cryptography primer. In this part, we will discuss the chain of trust. What if Alice and Bob don't know each other? Until now, we only considered the case of Alice and Bob knowing and trusting each other. If Alice and Bob are strangers, before they can trust each other, they must establish a chain of trust for both of them in which they share a common trust anchor or root of trust. This root of trust will essentially vouch for Alice to Bob and vouch for Bob to Alice. Certificates are used to assure entities are genuine. The trust anchor is usually the OEM, or it could be a certificate authority, a CA, like Curio, Symantec, GoDaddy, etc. How exactly are certificates used to establish trust? In this cartoon example, we assume that Bob's mom and Alice know and trust each other, but Alice has never met Bob. Of course, Bob knows and trusts his own mother. Bob's mom happens to know that Alice will bump into Bob later on today, so she asks Alice, "Can you please give my son a message for me?" Alice responds, "Bob doesn't know me. How will he trust the genuineness of the message?" No problem. Give him this certificate of message authenticity. With this certificate, he will be able to realize the message comes from me and no other, and he'll be able to trust it. Alice bumps into Bob later on that day and says, "Hey, I've got a message from your mom." Bob, being suspicious, says, "Who the heck are you and what have you done with my mom?" Alice then presents the certificate. Bob reads it, realizes the message came from his mom and no other, and he's very happy to hear from her. Now, this is an example of message authentication. You could imagine Bob's mom could have given Alice a certificate directing Bob to trust whatever Alice says from that point on. This is the way systems are sometimes pruned off and given to clients. If we can go back to our lighting control or lighting network example, a lighting company will come into, say, a college campus, and they'll put lights all over the college campus. And during the install phase, they will use the chain of trust right back to their headquarters. But when they're done, the college doesn't want them to have control over the lights. They want their local server to have control over their lights. So the lighting company will give a certificate to the local server, which will then broadcast that to the entire network. And now the entire network knows that the local server is the master of the network. What's inside of these certificates? The two most important things inside of the certificate is the subject public key and the digital signature. Using Bob's mom and Alice as an example, when Bob's mom gave Alice a certificate, what she did was she took Alice's public key. That would be the subject public key. And she signed it with her private key, and that would be that digital signature. Now, if this was an enclosed system and there was no need for interoperability with other vendors and other devices, that would be enough. The subject public key and its digital signature would be enough for all of the nodes in the network to trust. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we have to interoperate with other vendors' devices. So we have this X.509 certificate with a lot more information in it. It has notice the second line says algorithm ID. Other vendors might not know you're using, say, SHA-256 or AES-128 or whatever. You have to tell them. Also, you might want to have a validity date or dates. So something's not valid before a particular time and not valid after a particular time. And there's all kinds of things that we can put in this X.509 certificate, along with the subject public key and digital signature. Now, how does all of that other data get assured? Now, how does the entire certificate become assured? We know how a public key would be assured. Bob's mom would simply sign the public key. If we're using a certificate, she wouldn't sign just the public key. What would happen is all of this would be placed in a document. That document would then be hashed, and we would have a digest of the document. Bob's mom would then sign that digest, thereby assuring the entire contents, including the subject public key. Let's look how certificates are used in a real-world system. Let's look at the example of asymmetrically authenticating ink cartridges, for example. These ink cartridges will be made by both the OEM and licensees of the OEM. So we'll need a chain of trust because you'll have two different manufacturing sites creating ink cartridges, and both ink cartridges need to be authenticated. In this case, you'd never want to use a symmetric key because you would have to share that symmetric key with your licensee, and you would have no way of knowing how well that licensee would protect that key. Let's look at how this provisioning process happens in the factory. The OEM will have a root of trust. They'll either own this root of trust directly or they'll hire a certificate authority to manage it. But the root of trust will have an authority private key and authority public key. There will then be a manufacturing line. That manufacturing line will have a hardware security module on it, which will protect the public and private keys of the manufacturing line. We will be making ink cartridges, the disposable device, on this manufacturing line, and each ink cartridge will have its own public-private key. The first thing that happens is the manufacturing line will send its public key to the root of trust. The root of trust will sign it with their private key, creating a certificate. This certificate will assure the world that this manufacturing line is genuine. The manufacturing line will ask the secure element in the ink cartridge for its public key. The manufacturing line will sign that public key with its own private key, creating a certificate which tells the world or assures the world that this ink cartridge was made on that particular manufacturing line. Now, when this ink cartridge gets out into the world, people are going to want to know more than was this ink cartridge made on that particular manufacturing line. They need to know that the manufacturing line is genuine in itself. So that information is also placed inside the ink cartridge. Now let's imagine ourselves in someone's home. They have a printer. They went to the store and bought an ink cartridge and they put it into the printer. The first thing that we need to know is that the printer has the authority public key. Every printer that we make would have to be programmed with the authority public key. This public key, it resides inside of a crypto element. Some of you may be saying, wait, public keys are not private. They're public information. So why does it need to be protected? It needs to be protected because if someone were able to change that public key, they could essentially hijack the entire ecosystem and then have your printer only accept these rogue print cartridges. It wouldn't even accept true OEM print cartridges anymore. So the first thing we do is the printer has to verify the manufacturing public key. It requests that public key and the certificate from the ink cartridge. It uses the knowledge of the authority public key as well as the public key from the ink cartridge, the manufacturing public key, along with the certificate to authenticate the signature inside of that certificate. Once that authenticates, now it can be trusted. We now verify the device public key. The printer asks for the device public key along with the certificate, and it verifies the signature on that certificate. Once that is verified okay, we can go to the next step, which is the challenge and response. We need to challenge and get a response from the ink cartridge, because if you look at everything we've done here so far, you could easily record that and replay it at a later date. How do you know it's truly the ink cartridge? We have to test it. We do trust the device public key, but if that ink cartridge is truly who it claims to be, it should also have the associated device private key. So we make a random number and we send it to the ink cartridge asking it to sign that random number. The digital signature comes back and we verify that digital signature, yes or no. Now we know the ink cartridge is truly genuine. The whole idea of a disposable means that you'll eventually throw it out. We could authenticate OEM ink cartridges all day, but if we don't somehow limit their life, people could simply refill them. So all of our devices, in fact, most secure elements from most vendors, have a monotonic counter. It's a one-way counter. It can't be reset. And we program this counter for how many squirts the ink cartridge should have. Let's say it's 1,000,000 squirts. And after 1,000,000 squirts, we assume this ink cartridge is empty, no matter how much ink is still left in it. Now let's create a signed message, an authenticated message. Alice will start off with Alice's private key and the plain text message she wants to send. We're not going to encrypt anything here. We're just going to send it plain text, and Bob will receive it and realize it comes from Alice, nobody else but Alice, and it was unaltered. Alice hashes the plain text, creating a digest, which she signs with her private key, creating a signature. She then puts the plain text into a digital envelope along with the signature and sends this off to Bob. Bob receives this digital envelope from Alice, takes out the plain text, hashes it, puts the plain text to the side, doesn't use it yet, he doesn't realize it's genuine or not, uses the digest from the hash along with Alice's public key to verify the signature. Now let's start talking about encrypting messages. Before we encrypt, as you already know from previous parts of this presentation, we need session keys or a session key. Maybe multiple, maybe one. Depends on which cipher we use. So let's talk about creating session keys with public key. Probably the best way in the PKI infrastructure to create a common key between two elements is Diffie-Hellman. This presentation assumes elliptic curve cryptography, so we will talk about ECDH. This is elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. It's an anonymous key agreement protocol allowing two parties, each with their own public-private pairs, to establish a unique secret between them. Assume Alice and Bob have public-private key pairs. If Alice takes Bob's public key and dot multiplies it with her private key, and Bob does similarly if he takes Alice's public key and dot multiplies it with his private key, magically, they will arrive at exactly the same number. This is a way of arriving at a shared secret between two parties that never has to be transmitted. Alice will know what Bob's public key is from when she authenticated Bob, and Bob offered her the certificate and she verified the signature, and remember all that? So Bob and Alice will have each other's public key and trust them. So they do this Diffie-Hellman math and they wind up arriving at exactly the same number, which is very convenient. By the way, this is used in TLS, and when it's used in TLS, it's not known as a shared secret. It's known as a pre-master secret. Another one of those annoying examples of different names for exactly the same thing. Sending encrypted message using Diffie-Hellman. Alice wants to send Bob a secure message, and Bob needs assurance the message came from Alice and was unaltered. So Alice decides to send a message to Bob, so the first thing she does is calculates the shared secret she has uniquely with Bob. She takes Bob's public key, dot multiplies it with her private key, and comes up with the shared secret. Once Alice calculates the shared secret, she's ready to go. She starts off with her private key, the plain text, and the shared secret. She hashes the plain text, creating a digest, which she signs to create the signature. She then encrypts the plain text with the shared secret, creating ciphertext, which she puts into a digital envelope and sends to Bob. On Bob's end, he needs to recreate that shared secret, so he picks up Alice's public key, dot multiplies it with his private key to create exactly the same shared secret that Alice arrived at. Bob opens the digital envelope that Alice sent and takes the shared secret to decrypt the ciphertext, turning it into plain text. He then hashes the plain text, creating a digest, which he uses along with Alice's public key to verify the signature and say yes or no, this came from Alice or not. If it's a yes, then it came from Alice and no one else, and it arrived unaltered. But the method we just described would use the same shared secret over and over as the encryption key. We really shouldn't do that. We should have session keys. I explained this before in an earlier part of this presentation. So a best practice would be to use Diffie-Hellman again. This time it's called ECDHE for elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, ephemeral meaning short-lived. The way this would work would be first, Alice and Bob would of course authenticate each other. Now Alice would have confidence in Bob's public key and vice versa. Bob would have confidence in Alice's public key. Now both Bob and Alice would spawn new public-private keys. They would send their new public keys to each other via authenticated messaging. We covered this earlier in this presentation. They would take the new public key and of the other and dot multiply it against their own private key. This would create a new shared secret based on the new public-private keys they created. They would use this new shared secret as their session key. Once used, the shared secret, along with the public-private keys used to create it, are completely destroyed. And the next time communication occurs, that process is repeated. Robust node authentication must be implemented prior to this because you would not want to authenticate potentially an adversary to create a shared secret with you. This is often referred to as perfect forward secrecy. If you can imagine, say, a video camera in your home for a security system, it's in there for 10 years. After a while, you forget it's there. You don't know what you've done in front of it. You don't know what it's captured. You don't want people to be able to decode everything 10 years worth of video if for some reason your keys were compromised. Using this ECDHE, those keys can never be compromised because everything is destroyed. If someone were to do a brute force attack on one transmission, and they were, let's say they were even successful with it, they would have to do that brute force attack on every single transmission that your camera made. And that's just infeasible. Our devices can spawn new public-private keys in milliseconds, but let's assume you're using devices that were unable to do that, so you couldn't use ECDHE. You could also use a KDF. This is an industry standard deterministic pseudo-random number generator whose output depends on an initialization vector. So you would use your shared secret and a random number in this KDF. Or you could just use a random number and hash it with your shared secret to create a session key. Let's review how the whole system would work. Alice and Bob have their public-private keys. Through a chain of trust and authentication, they would reliably exchange public keys. They would then implement Diffie-Hellman to create a shared secret. Again, if we're talking about TLS here, it would be called a pre-master secret. They would create their session keys somehow. They would use ECDHE, ephemeral ECDH, or they would use a KDF, or they would simply hash their shared secret with a random number to somehow they would create a session key, which would be used on a cipher to create plain text, to take plain text, turn it into ciphertext, and then turn ciphertext back into plain text. Now that we've gone over the fundamentals of cryptography, the functions, now let's talk about what's needed on a hardware level for strong security. The first thing we need is a high entropy random number generator. Attacks on the randomness of the numbers used is one of the primary attacks on cryptography. So you really want to have a high quality, high entropy random number generator. Any microcontroller you decide to use needs an immutable area of genuine code which can be trusted. This unchangeable, unhackable area of code is relied upon to be used with your hardware cryptography to then assure all the remaining code is genuine, and then, and only then, do you bootstrap the system. You need a hardware-enforced, persistent, secure area for secrets and the critical crypto primitives, hopefully with anti-tamper protections. Crypto authentication devices protect more than just the secrets and keys. They have to also protect these crypto primitives of authentication, integrity check, key spawning, things like that. The reason is if you are able to hack these functions, you no longer need the keys. An adversary could have your device authenticate just about anything. You need a strong cryptographic methodology and a robust chain of trust. This presentation is assuming elliptic curve cryptography, which is the current standard. ECC has essentially replaced RSA due to the smaller key size and similar levels of security. ECC 256-bit is roughly equivalent to RSA 3072-bit. So ECC is a very robust methodology to use. You also need a well thought out ecosystem and infrastructure. One of the awful truths is that any device can be hacked if someone is in physical possession of it and they have the motivation and the means to hack it. You do not want any compromised unit to then compromise your entire ecosystem. So we need to try to build ecosystems which can hopefully detect a compromised unit. But even if it can't detect a compromised unit, build it in such a way so that compromised unit can't compromise the entire ecosystem. And again, we have this discussion with clients all the time and try to help them with this. Why hardware security features? Why not do this in firmware? Why not save the money? The problem is manyfold. First, you can't hide keys in firmware. As much as you think you can, you can't. The problem is the keys are the result of high entropy random number generators. And that means that the key itself is high entropy. The problem with code in the embedded world is it's incredibly low entropy. So all someone has to do is send your chip to a lab along with about $500, and they will decapsulate the chip and probe the chip and give you back the hex file of that microcontroller. And the keys will shine out like beacons because they have such high entropy. They will be different than all the other data around it. Hardware security devices are incredibly difficult to do that with for a number of reasons. They have active shields across multiple layers. All memories are internally encrypted. So even if they were able to get past the shields and get to the cells, the information stored in those cells is encrypted. We have data-independent crypto execution. It means that when you're very close to a key, sometimes algorithms will resolve very quickly. And if you're very far from a key, they'll take much longer. We take exactly the same amount of time no matter if you're 1 bit away from the key or if all 256 bits are wrong. We have randomized math operations, so we don't do things in a normal order. Internal state consistency checking, voltage tampers, temperature tampers, etc. All to thwart physical attacks. Another reason why you should consider hardware is it's much faster and lower power. The functions that we're talking about are complex with lots of CPU cycles if they were implemented on a microcontroller. They'll use lots of power and take a long time. On this graph, you'll see key generation. We'll do this in a couple of milliseconds, whereas a Cortex M0 Plus running at 48 megahertz will do this in more than 3 seconds. Thanks for watching Microchip Channels, and I hope you learned more about embedded security.